I'd like to introduce Roger Hallam. Roger is co-founder of the global environmental activist movement Extinction Rebellion, theorist of civil disobedience, and author of Common Sense for the 21st Century. Only non-violent rebellion can now stop climate breakdown and social catastrophe. Roger, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, well, I've done quite a few of these presentations, as you can probably imagine, and one of the things I notice is when people are talking about the climate crisis, and let's call it a climate crisis to start off with rather than climate change, okay? There's just an avoiding of actually getting down to what the actual figures and the killer facts are. You know, we're just endlessly told that there's this problem and it's quite amorphous and way off and what have you. But the fact of the matter is, over the last 10, 20 years, we pretty much know what's going to happen. And what's going to happen is mass starvation and social collapse. And that's already locked in. I just want to say that again, because I think it's important to sort of grasp what we're talking about here. We're talking about mass starvation and social collapse in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. No one quite knows, but we know it's coming. And the reason we know it's coming is because it's physics, right? This isn't a matter of ideology. It's not a matter of personal opinion. It's a matter of physical laws. I think people may have noticed that in the press in the last few days, there's been a report coming out that has the new sensitivity analysis on the climate. When we get to 560 parts per million of CO2 equivalent, then we're going to be locked in and experiencing 5 degrees centigrade global temperature increase. We thought for about 3 or 4 decades it was going to be 3 degrees, which is a total catastrophe. 5 degrees is in the territory of human extinction. In case you're not aware, 5 degrees centigrade is actually 10 to 15 degrees centigrade above today's temperatures inland, which means on a hot day, it's something like 20 to 25 degrees hotter than it is today, which means you can't grow food because you can't grow food over 30 degrees centigrade. What that means is mass starvation. What that means is a large part of the globe is going to become uninhabitable, not for a year or two, not for a decade, not for a century, but for tens of thousands of years, potentially forever. That's what we're facing. That's where we're going to. And it's the physics, right? It's not really open to debate anymore. I can give you a few other stats just to support it. At 4 degrees centigrade, the tropics are going to be uninhabitable for 6 months of the year, according to a recent paper. At 35 degrees centigrade and high humidity, the wet bulb effect is locked in. If people aren't aware of what the wet bulb effect is, maybe you should understand what it is, because it means death in 6 hours. It means the body can't cool down. At 2 degrees centigrade, the estimate from a recent paper is 1 billion people will be subject to this sort of extreme heat. Subject to this sort of extreme heat basically means they're going to die or they're going to be on the move. And that increases by 1 billion people every degree centigrade. So that's 3 billion people at 3 degrees, 2 billion people at 3 degrees, and so on, up to 5 degrees. So where's all this nonsense about 1.5, we're going to keep below 1.5? Where's all this nonsense about 2 degrees, you know, we can stay below 2 degrees? Everyone knows in the scientific community there's a carbon lag, and there's a figure on it. You can look it up. It's around 0.6. So we're 1.1 at the moment, plus 0.6, I make that 1.7. So why is the whole scientific establishment winding away about 1.5 degrees? It's a mass delusion situation. And we can add on all the other things which individually would be a mass catastrophe on their own. We've cut down 17% of the Amazon at 20 to 25%. It goes into a feedback system, which means it dies back and it's gone. That means we're contributing carbon to the atmosphere because we haven't got the trees. We can throw in methane, we can look at forest fires, we can look at water vapor, we can look at a whole load of feedback mechanisms that have already been locked in, which means even if we stopped putting carbon into the atmosphere tomorrow, we're already heading for a mass catastrophe. The other thing that people don't really talk about is what precisely does this mean for the average person, for the average British person, for the average student at Cambridge? Well, let's start off with what it means most, especially at the moment. It means economic collapse. What does economic collapse mean? It means that you're losing your jobs, you're losing your income, your house drops in value, you haven't got an education, the NHS collapses. If you thought that was completely ridiculous, think about what's happened for the last 3 months. What happens next is hunger. Hunger is a driver of social collapse. If you don't understand that, then look at some history. When people get hungry, they start killing each other. It's very rapid and it's not pretty. What happens after that is war, rape, starvation, death. Have a look at what happened in the Second World War. Let's have a look at what happened in the Congo. This is what happens when societies collapse. And in case you don't quite get it, this leads to human extinction. Human extinction through mass heat, through loss of habitat, through starvation, and through a reduction in oxygen. And you can look that last one up because I haven't got enough time to explain it. So what does this mean practically? What does it mean in terms of morality? One of the things that all these discussions do is they tend to imply we've got some sort of natural crisis here. We haven't got a natural crisis here. We've got a situation of catastrophic, unbelievable criminality. We know that these effects are being created by policies put in place by people with names and addresses. They're the top politicians and they're the people running the companies. These people are engaged in the mass murder of the human race. That's the situation. So how does this relate to COVID? Well, COVID is just a small little prelude, isn't it? A little example. We know it was in the papers last week that the British establishment is so embarrassingly stupid that it can't understand the exponential function. If it shut down the British economy a week earlier than it did, it would have saved 20 to 30,000 lives. That's not very impressive for Cambridge and Oxford, is it? Because these people educated these people who can't even understand something as basic as looking what happened in China and looking what happened in Italy. It wasn't like we didn't know. And now we've got 20 to 30,000 grieving families and a massive amount of unnecessary suffering. This tells us two things. The elites are unbelievably stupid and they're unbelievably uncaring. That's the situation. What does this mean practically? What does it mean like this week? I'm talking to mothers this week who are in tears because they know their children are going to die. I'm talking to young people this week who don't see any point doing an education, don't see any point in the future because they know they're going to be starving to death. What does it mean for Cambridge students joining the elites? It means in 10 or 20 years' time, they're going to be administrating the response to mass starvation. We're entering endless war. That's what the new generation is looking at, and that's what Cambridge students are looking at. So what's the solution? You'll notice from the other three speakers and from the establishment generally, there's no talk about the obvious solution. It's a historically illiterate perspective because everyone knows what the solution is. The solution is rebellion. To take down the governments and replace them with people's assemblies who will actually get on with the job. We've had 20, 30 years of catastrophic failure, and now it's time to act. Mass civil disobedience works, mass protest works. We've just seen that with Black Lives Matter. What we need is thousands of people on the street. And I invite the Cambridge students and anyone listening to this to get in touch with Extinction Rebellion, The rebellion is going to be back on the go later in August, in September. This isn't just like an additional idea. You know, this is it. This is now. This is the reality we face. And what I'd like to suggest is it's quite slightly obscene to continue to analyze the situation. What we need to do is to talk about what we are going to do, what Cambridge University is going to do, what's it going to do with, what is it, £377 million of fossil fuel investments? Why is it still investing? That's the key question for Cambridge University at the moment. Does it want to engage in continually, catastrophically criminal activity? So what I'd like to ask the other three panelists is, what's the plan? Seriously, guys, what's the plan? You know, let's talk about how we're going to respond. Let's interrogate 30 years of establishment failure. That's where I'd like to contribute.
Well, thank you very much, Roger, for those somewhat dystopian thoughts, but not least for helping broaden out our debate. I will take on that question actually and open it up to the other panelists. Is there anyone here who would mount perhaps a defence of the establishment's involvement in climate politics? I see a hand from Martin Rees, so I will pass over now.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm certainly not going to defend our government. I mean, I think they're second-rate ideologues and chancers. I've got no opinion of them at all. But I mean, I do disagree with these conclusions, because first of all, what we do in what matters for the climate is what happened in India. And the question is, what's Extinction Rebellion going to do to stop India building more coal-fired power stations, unless they can more cheaply have some sort of clean energy? And so my recipe is that we ought to be encouraging researchers in the UK and worldwide to really have a blitz on clean energy R&D and deployment, so that we can help India to leapfrog directly to a carbon-free economy and a less devastatingly poor economy than they have now. So I think to turn England into a sort of anarchy and do nothing for India is going to make the world far worse. So I think we want to use the fact that we in the UK can, if we have this commitment and the idealism of young people, we can really make a big difference if we accelerate R&D and redeploy effort away from, say, aviation into clean energy, and also into better ways of growing food that are more robust against changes in climate. So I think the answer lies in science and making a mess of the UK, which Extinction Rebellion would do, is going to do nothing for India and will make the world's situation worse. So I'm very strongly against what's just been said.
Might I ask, we've got a question here from the YouTube live chat, which I think sort of feeds into this a little bit. Louisa asks, how do we foster long-termism into our political systems? Democratic systems by nature produce short-term time horizons. There is little incentive to focus long-term, e.g. on mitigating ecological breakdown. Do we agree that there is some sort of fundamental weakness in the way that Western democratic systems are set up? And is that something that will hold us back in dealing with coronavirus or with climate change? Is there anyone that would like to take that on? Perhaps one for Alice?
Sure, I will address the comments. For me, what COVID has illustrated is that we actually need strong governments to address catastrophic risk. As we've heard from Will, we've had focus on private markets. The markets will solve this, private sector will solve this. I think COVID has made clear that the private sector cannot solve this on their own. They can be a partner, but we need strong governments. And with strong governments, we have the necessary money to invest in the science, and then also provide the incentives to make this switch. And if we can focus on that, and in the United States, that would probably require us to do some campaign finance reform so that we have politicians who are not beholden to special interests. But we also need to have long-term policies. You know, after World War II, after that experience of the generation of young men, the United States saw great collective action by its government to build some great structures that have lasted us now or in a failing state, but that we need. So I think that this disparagement of government is short-sighted. I cannot imagine that removing the government structures will allow us to organize sufficiently to make the kinds of changes we need. And I think we need scientific investment to help us answer some of these questions that still plague us, including the technology that would allow us to remove carbon from the atmosphere at a scale that's economically feasible. So I would think we need to actually go in the different direction, but make sure that we have the political leadership that can lead us in the way we need to go.
I think Will would like to come in on that point.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the point about the democracy and long-termism. I don't think there's any particular problem with democracy that any other system doesn't have. And in fact, I think a lot of our democracies have some, advantages and capacities that other kinds of systems lack. And what we need to do is try to make the most of those. So here in the US, our democratic system isn't very democratic. As I mentioned before, the pain of both of these crises fall, very disproportionately on more vulnerable people. And those are precisely the people that our electoral system tends to underrepresent, that our political system makes it very, very hard for people to vote. So the people who are most likely to get hurt are the people that are least empowered to have their voice heard in our democracy. And that creates problems. Part of the function of democracy is protective. It's for self-defense. You need to give people a voice so that they can speak up for their own rights and interests, that they have some mechanism that's going to defend them when they're in danger. And if you strip people of equal protection of their rights and of their political liberties, they're not going to be able to defend themselves. And that actually puts us in danger, right? Like the people who are most likely to be hurt are the people who are most likely to deliver the political will to do something about it. And if you systematically disenfranchise those people, you put yourself in danger. And I want to echo Alice Hill's point about just corruption and influence in political systems. That's clearly a profound problem that we have now. And again, it's a failure of our democracy to be democratic, that the rule-making and policy-making process can be so thoroughly co-opted by powerful interests, and that the people as a whole have so little authoritative role in shaping the rules and laws that that will determine their lives, that determine their fates. And so there's a lot of reform that we need to do to make our democratic systems democratic. And that, I think, will actually help deal with these problems, make our systems more responsive, and make sure that the people who are most likely to suffer are empowered to make their voices heard and to change things before bad things happen.
Okay, we've got a couple of panelists who want to make a point. I thought I'd just expand on that and say, if our current systems are not enormously democratic, and this is perhaps one for Roger again, are there better ways of getting citizens involved, and what beyond kind of direct activism? I know there's talk in the YouTube live stream there about citizens' assemblies. What sort of role do you think that they might play in improving the system?
You speaking to me, yeah?
Yeah.
Well, I just want to come back just to make clear that I think that with all due respect and what have you, the last three panelists, what you've said is all wishful thinking, ironically, because there's no theory of change. There's no actual plan. There's just a wishing that the system will get better. What we need to understand is how systems become better. And in times of extreme corruption, we know how that works. It comes through popular protest. And we also know from social science over the last 30 years, the most effective mechanism of dealing with governmental corruption and criminality is mass participation civil disobedience, which means thousands of people disrupting capital cities until governments change or are reformed. What we're talking about here is creating stronger government, not less government. That's what the plan is. And the reason why thousands and tens of thousands of people around the world are engaging in civil disobedience is the pennies dropped that establishment organizations and establishment figures have no plan. There's no plan here. And that's why people need to take to the streets. And the other thing to say is, if they don't take to the streets, what we're dealing with in the next 10, 15, 20 years will be violent uprisings. Because when Daily Mail readers and such like realize that their prosperity has been destroyed by the carbon elite class, they are not going to be happy. They're not going to be committed to non-violence like Extinction Rebellion is. And that's why I'd invite you all, particularly Lord Martin Rees, to come and join us and sit in the road in London, just like Bertrand Russell did, right? You know, the aristocrats and the elites used to have some responsibility for the continuation of the nation. But I don't see anything happening in Cambridge University. I don't see any movement by the elite figures in this country to say, I want to actually help save this country from destruction. And the reason for that is very straightforward. It's plain and simple cowardice. There's no sense of honor. There's no sense of duty. There's no sense of putting nation before money. And that's the value system that built this country in the past, is it not? So that would be my challenge, particularly to Martin, but also to Alice and Will, is the game's up. We all know the game's up. And just to be clear, there is a plan. We all know what the plan is. If you read what Extinction Rebellion has to say on the subject, it's all around the world, ordinary people are taking control of their collective lives through citizens' assemblies. That's randomized selections of citizens making decisions because politicians are completely incapable of doing so. So there's a gradualist and sensible and non-violent solution here, but it does involve going to the streets. And again, that's what I'd invite Cambridge students to do. You know where we are, Extinction Rebellion, look it up. I'm very interested to hear from Martin on joining me sitting down in Strand in September.
Yes. Fine. Well, let me say I'm in principle happy to have these peaceful protests in the city, as long as they don't disrupt ordinary people like you did on underground trains and things like that. That was a real own goal from your point of view. But I think a peaceful disturbance, which doesn't really harm people too much, raises the profile of the issue. And I want to say that the key thing to do is to make people care about a long-term issue like climate change when there's always immediate problems like COVID-19. And I think politicians will in fact do the right thing if the voters support them. Mr. Jean-Claude Juncker, maybe not everyone's favorite politician, he famously said that people in politics know the right thing to do. What they don't know is how to get re-elected when they've done it. And therefore they don't do it. And that is why I think we do want these demonstrations, in order to make people aware that these are crucial long-term issues. And then the politician will do the right thing. Let me take one rather trivial example, which was Mr. Gove, not a very enlightened man, agreeing to have legislation on non-reusable plastic drinking straws and such like. He only did that, and I know it was a very small thing, because the David Attenborough programs had made millions of people aware for the first time of the dangers of pollution by plastics in the ocean. He knew that he could make this very minor reform without losing support. And if we can have mega versions of that, where the public does really care and is prepared to make sacrifices, then the politicians will do it. But going back to Cambridge University, I think that much the most important thing Cambridge University can do is have a mega research program to improve batteries, to improve other kinds of clean energy and energy storage for not only the UK, but far more important for India, to make sure that India doesn't have to depend on coal-fired power stations. And indeed, as Will said earlier, I think there may be a problem because one consequence of the pandemic is that the price of oil has gone right down. So it's even more likely now that India is going to build coal-fired power stations and not renewables. So we've got to bring down the cost of renewables and make them more sophisticated. And that is where a university like Cambridge can really do some good. So I think we ought to inspire young people who are idealistic to do things like that in the climate. And also we have a major plant science department. And what we need to do is to ensure that we can feed 9 billion people by mid-century. This needs high tech in order to feed everyone and avoid encroaching on forests to do it. So here again, it's the expertise which we are going to need and which we can develop. Just as in the case of COVID-19, we want expertise to be deployed, and that's what universities can do.
I thought I also ask perhaps.
Can I just say that presumably, Martin, that means that you would like Cambridge universities to stop being corrupted by oil companies. I'm sure you're aware there's the Cambridge Arctic Shelf Programme, there's the BP Institute, which is ploughing money into mass suicide projects of taking oil out of the Arctic and such like. So I think this is an opportunity, you know, as an ex-Trinity man, as you've said you are, to say to Cambridge University, the game's up, get out of oil while you can, where you've got some self-respect as an institution, and rightly, as you say, put your energies into saving humankind rather than destroying it. Isn't that what you would agree with?
I think you're probably right, but on the other hand, as Bill Gates has said, you may be more effective if you're an activist shareholder rather than selling your shares, which are a tiny fraction and make very little difference. So I think it's not quite as simplistic as you're saying, that you should always disinvest rather than try and influence from inside.
Or I move the discussion on. I see Will there's put his hand up. Is there anything you'd like to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point about others in our discussion not having a plan. One of the things that, one of the basic facts, one of the animating facts about democracies is just rampant disagreement. People disagree about things, and we need institutions that contain that disagreement to protect, to keep it from, always spilling out onto the streets. Now, sometimes there's no alternative, and I think we all are in favor of peaceful protest that creates pressure to make change. But it's very difficult to know what the thresholds are. Like, how much do you need? Like what happens if you get counter protests of a certain size? Like, what happens if they do become violent and the police, come out and start smacking protesters around, which has been happening in cities all over the country here in the US in the Black Lives Matter protests. To me, that sounds like wishful thinking, that somehow we're just going to summon the popular will to mobilize millions of people onto the streets, and that they will all be so aligned in their perspective that will drive policy change in a particular direction, and then that will solve the problem, or that will have people randomly selected, have citizens assemblies or little deliberative democracy, experiments, and that what they determine in those things will be considered authoritative by anybody else, and that it would be binding in some political way on anyone else. This all seems very wishful to me. I think, the things that my institution is trying to do, which is to, create market structures to incentivize decarbonization, is a plan. It's hard. Just
with all due respect, you've been pushing that line for 30 years, right? And carbon emissions have gone up 60% globally since 1990, since the scientists told the world that we're heading towards ecological catastrophe. So it's totally intellectually ridiculous to want to continue to pursue something that's catastrophically failed. everyone knows that civil disobedience
Or
isn't guaranteed to work.
should
But,
give Martin a bit more, a little bit more room just to expand on his proposals there for a second.
Well, I was just going to mention that this is the kind of establishment